Michael Jackson and Paul McCartney were once close friends, but in 1985, Michael pulled a sneaky move that would kill their friendship forever. Our story starts before Michael even started music. Just before the Beatles became popular in the early 60s, Paul McCartney signed a deal that he would regret for the rest of his life. The Beatles were just four working-class kids from Liverpool who knew next to nothing about the music industry, and in particular, music publishing. Paul said in an interview,
"But we didn't think songs could be owned, me and John. We just thought they were in the
sky and people could listen to them. Well, pretty soon you had to get to know they could be owned, because someone else already knew that they weren't in the sky." In 1963, a company called Northern Songs was set up, which was run by a music publisher named Dick James, who also owned a majority stake in the company. The group's manager, Brian Epstein, also had a stake. Paul McCartney and John Lennon, who wrote most of the songs, were both given a 20% stake in the company, meaning that only 40% was given to the actual creators of the songs. 2 years later, Northern Songs became a public company, and the structure of the business was rearranged. John and Paul were now allocated 15% of the company each, and a small percentage was given to the two remaining members of the Beatles, George and Ringo. Paul said, "It meant that the lion's share went to somebody else."
Actually, one guy we never even met.
The popularity of the Beatles reached levels like never seen before. During concerts, the speaker systems couldn't deal with the sounds of screaming girls from the crowds, and John Lennon jokingly said that they were bigger than Jesus. And it dawned upon them just how much they were being screwed over by the Northern Songs deal. George Harrison, who was now writing more and more songs for the group, even composed a track called Only a Northern Song, which contained the lyrics, "It doesn't really matter what chords I play, what words I say, or time of day it is, as it's only a Northern song." In August 1967, their manager Brian Epstein died from a drug overdose, and it was expected that the publishing deal was going to be renegotiated. In 1969, James planned to sell his majority stake in the company and was even given offers by John and Paul. Instead, James sold it to another music company called ATV without even notifying John and Paul, who were both on their honeymoons with their wives. These commercial woes added fuel to the fire, which led to the breakup of the Beatles next year. Ultimately, John and Paul reluctantly decided to cash out and sell their shares in Northern Songs. For Paul, lessons were learned about the music industry. He was much more savvy when signing contracts for his solo projects and his new group named Wings. He even got into the business of buying other people's songs, and in 1976 bought some of the music catalog of Buddy Holly. The mid to late 70s was also when Michael Jackson was trying to launch his solo career, whose talents had far exceeded the other members of the Jackson 5. For his breakthrough album Off the Wall, he was convinced by producer Quincy Jones to cover the song Girlfriend, a song which had been released a year earlier by Paul McCartney. And on Christmas Day, 1980, these two heavyweight titans of the music industry would finally be introduced to each other. When recalling this moment, Paul McCartney said, "Somebody rang me up and this high voice I didn't recognize said, 'Hi, Paul.' I thought, this is a girl fan, and how the hell did she get my number? I was quite annoyed." It soon dawned on him who was on the other side of the phone. It wasn't a girl, it was Michael Jackson, and he basically said, "Do you want to make some hits?" The proposition made sense for both parties. Paul was entering his 40s, and with his popularity waning, it made sense to work with one of music's brightest new talents. Michael Jackson, meanwhile, was also benefiting from working with one of the world's greatest songwriters. But instead of Paul simply writing songs for Michael, Quincy Jones encouraged them to work together in the studio. Michael traveled to England to hang out with him, and their friendship blossomed. And in April 1982, they met together in Westlake Studios in LA to write some songs. The fruits of their efforts were 3 songs. They worked on the song The Girl Is Mine, which would be released on Michael's upcoming album at the time, Thriller. During this period, major radio stations and MTV were not really playing black artists, and having a song with Paul McCartney would make it that extra bit more difficult to ignore Michael's talent. They also worked on a song, The Man, and Say, 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 which is arguably their biggest effort together. It was during the recording sessions of Say, Say, Say that their friendship began to sour. At some point, Michael turned to Paul and asked him for advice. And with this, Paul remembered the naive kid he was back in Liverpool and how he was taken advantage of by higher-ups. Standing in front of him was a talented kid with the world at his feet, and he wanted to make sure he didn't face the same issues. In an interview with Graham Norton, Paul recalls,
"Michael said, have you got any advice? So I said, yeah, look, this is what you got to do. You're really hot. It's just starting. It just had Off the Wall. And I said, you're going to make some great
videos. So he went off and made Thriller and things like that. I said, you got to get a really good manager because it's all going to be coming in and it could all go out if you don't. And I said, you ought to think of getting into song publishing.
It's very good business. You love music. I'm into it. It does very well. It's a nice, easy business for a musician to be in.
When told to invest in song publishing, Michael's response was,
I'm going to get your songs. I'm going to buy your songs.
To which Paul gave a playful dig on the arm and said, good one. He would later realize that he was far from joking around. In 1985, ATV put its music catalog up for sale. It contained 4,000 songs, but more importantly, it contained the bulk of the Beatles recordings. For Paul, it seemed only right that the rights to the Beatles music went back to the original members, but he didn't feel right buying them all for himself, and most of these Beatles songs are credited as Lennon and McCartney, and John Lennon had sadly been shot dead 5 years earlier. So Paul contacted Lennon's widow, Yoko Ono, in the hopes of collectively buying this catalog, but despite being one of the biggest stars on the planet, he was outbid. Michael Jackson had taken his advice to get into music publishing and bought the 4,000-song catalog for $47.5 million. This price was too steep for Paul and Yoko, but Michael reportedly said, "You can't put a price on a Picasso. You can't put a price on these songs. There's no value on them. They're the best songs that have ever been written." Jackson also allegedly scribbled a note to his lawyer which said, "John, please let's not bargain. I don't want to lose the deal. It's my catalog." Yoko Ono was happy that the catalog was being controlled by an artist rather than a corporation, but Paul was a lot less impressed. He said, "I think it's dodgy to do something like that, to be someone's friend and then buy the rug they're standing on." While Paul was a wealthy man, Thriller was an album that was breaking records left, right, and center. His collaboration with Paul McCartney helped him break into more of white America, and the advice on doing music videos paid off in spades too. In the 80s, inflation levels were high, so it made sense to invest your money into something that had longevity. So Michael took Paul's last piece of advice and went into music publishing and bought all those songs. In the aftermath, Paul and Michael were no longer on speaking terms, and who knows how Paul might have felt when 2 years later, Michael released the hit single Smooth Criminal. Paul did many interviews complaining about the ordeal, but Michael never said a word. He did, however, write in his 1989 autobiography, Moonwalk, "Paul and I both learned the hard way about business, and the importance of publishing and royalties, and the dignity of songwriting." But it wasn't just the purchase of his music that annoyed Paul. It was also how Michael was using it. Paul said in an interview, "The other thing too that I don't think is too clever is the commerciality of them. In someone like Buddy Holly's case, he did commercials and was well into all of that. So if any of his songs get used these days for commercials, it's with the knowledge that he would have liked it or that his family wanted. The trouble is that we never did do commercials with the Beatles. We had lots of big offers
From soft drinks companies, you know, to do stuff, obviously, but we always thought, no, it kind of spoils it. Just takes that little edge off it.
The Beatles' song Revolution, which gives their nuanced take on political protest, was now being used in a Nike ad. Paul said, "Songs like Revolution, it meant more than just a pair of sneakers." In the 90s, Michael was in a similar situation when he met Paul, with his star power on the wane. But despite the fact that less money was coming in, Michael refused to curtail his massive spending habits and was now going bankrupt. In 1995, he sold half of ATV Music to Sony for $100 million, which already doubled his investment while still owning half of it, meaning that the catalog was now over 4 times more valuable than when he bought it in 1985. And the bitterness from Paul continued to fester inside him. In an interview with Howard Stern in 2001, Paul was asked about the incident and revealed that he had been trying to contact Michael. He said,
"I've actually written to him a couple of times, wrote a couple of letters saying, Michael, don't you think?"
after even if I was just a writer on the payroll after 30 years, right, of being reasonably successful for this company you now own, don't you think I could have a raise?
Yeah. And he said, "Oh, Paul, that's just business." I said, "Yeah."
And of course, he's still frustrated that he'll now have to pay millions for something he created. He added,
"I wrote him for nothing. And buying him back at these phenomenal sums, it's just can't do it."
In January 2009, the British newspaper The Mirror released a news story that claimed that Michael Jackson had written a new will that stated that all of the Beatles recordings would go to Paul after he died. The article said, "Sources close to Jackson said he was always regretted falling out with Macca." One insider said, "Michael is worried about his health, so decided it was time to look at his finances. Most of his estate had been divided up between his 3 children, But Michael told his lawyers he was sad he no longer talks to Sir Paul and said he wanted to make things right. Michael is suffering serious back and leg pain and has for a few years. He gets spasms in his back, which means he spends a lot of time in bed in a wheelchair. And later that year, Michael Jackson unexpectedly passed away. Paul put everything aside and said nice things about Michael to the press. He also released a statement on his website which read, "Some time ago, the media came up with the idea that Michael Jackson was going to leave his share in the Beatles songs to me in his will. It was completely made up. The report is that I am devastated to find that he didn't leave the songs to me. This is completely untrue. I had not thought for 1 minute that the original report about the will was true, and therefore, the report that I'm devastated is also totally false." The years went by, and in 2016, Sony bought out Michael's 50% for $750 million from his relatives, making them the sole owners of the catalog. But a year later, McCartney would take legal action against them. In 1976, the same year that Paul started buying Buddy Holly's music, an amendment was made to US copyright law, which allowed artists to claim back ownership of their work after a 35-year period had elapsed. This was something that would be assessed in a court setting, and McCartney was willing to fight this battle. Instead, both Sony and McCartney settled things outside of court for an undisclosed amount. It's unclear whether he gained ownership of his songs or not, but clearly he was satisfied with whatever it was that Sony gave him. Whatever the case, it's safe to say that Paul McCartney's 8 grandkids are probably doing okay. Make sure to subscribe for more.